welcome to episode number 37 of the Truth Nation podcast. I'm looking at the retired Chief Mark Garrett right now. Looking
Gladly
healthy, Mark.
Retired.
Glad, yeah, you and I both.
Yeah.
So Mark, when people ask you, or do people ask you, I assume they do, oh, do you miss it? What do you say?
I hate to give the cliche answer, but it's true. I miss a number of certain people
Yep.
in the organization. I miss some of the operations that we engaged in, things like that. But
Yep.
other than that, Bill, I love the California Highway Patrol, but I don't miss it. I don't miss the phone calls at 2 a.m, 3 a.m, 11 p.m, Christmas Day, Thanksgiving Day. I don't miss any of that crap.
That's my same answer. That is literally my same answer. I start by saying I don't miss it at all, not even a little bit. I do miss some of the people sometimes, but really, a lot of the, this is getting into a whole different discussion, but a lot of the politics and everything else that went along with it, I don't miss that. So
Yeah.
nice to have moved on.
Yes.
Speaking of moving on, Mark, today we're going to talk about a story that's been, there's a documentary on Netflix called Love on the Run, and there might be another tagline with that or something that I missed.
Jailbreak?
Jailbreak, that's it. Yeah, Jailbreak, Love on the Run.
Yeah.
The story of Vicky White and Casey White, and I think important to say up front, although the last name is the same, no relation, no familial relation between them, just happened to be each of their last names was White. And questions I'd like people to think about while you and I talk about this, Mark. And this is a story of Vicky White, a correctional officer, worked in the Department of the county jail in Alabama. And I'll get into details in a minute, but assisted an inmate with an escape, right? Three questions that I'll put out front, Mark, and let's answer them at the end. Was this really a loving relationship between the two, in your opinion, from each perspective? In other words, from his perspective, was he in love with Vicky White? Was Casey and White in love with Vicky White? Or was he just using and exploiting her? And then the opposite part of that, was Vicky White in love with him? Were there signs leading up to this jailbreak or escape that should have been seen by others working in the facility? And finally, Miss White, Vicky White, did not survive this jailbreak attempt. She, later on, she died. It was ruled I think specifically an accidental. The circumstances around it are a little bit weird. And I want to hear from you. Do you think it was or do you think she was murdered by Casey White? So with those things in mind, let's talk about this case. And Mark, I encountered corruption in my career, right? And really, for me, it was when I was a first line supervisor, had a group of federal agents, and there was a local cop that worked with us on a pretty regular basis that we had deputized. So he had, I think, some federal powers. And he wasn't working in our office space every day. He wasn't with us every day, but he was a very high performer, very competent detective, generated a lot of work in the drug space. I guess what you would kind of call a super successful narc. Ended up getting sentenced to 10 years federal prison time for being a drug trafficker, like actually being involved in drug trafficking, working with the informants that he worked with and selling drugs. So I've experienced it, and I often look back at, what I should have seen, didn't see, did see, etc. What's your experience with that? Do you have any, whether it's when you were, a captain, a chief, or riding the streets? Anything?
Yeah. Oh, anything. I was making notes to myself about the examples I could come up with. And of course, there are a lot out there, unfortunately, of people that I wasn't intimately interacting with on a daily basis. But there are a couple. I can think of immediately, right off the top of my head. One of them was we were fellow sergeants together and worked in a special detail, administrative detail, for quite some time. And he was actually my senior in the academy. We were in the
Wow.
academy together. He was 3 months ahead of me, and then we ended up being sergeants together in administrative roles. And at the time, I was public affairs sergeant for Southern Division, which is Los Angeles County Division of the Highway Patrol. And my superiors called me in to a meeting out of the blue. Hey, Mark, before you come down the hallway. Now, again, the sergeant and I worked on the same floor together and had known each other at that point for, I don't know, 14, 15 years. And so my bosses, including the chiefs on the floor, chiefs and chiefs, they all call me into the conference room. I walk in, and there are two people sitting there in business attire, two FBI agents. And I had no idea. I'm sitting down, it's a big table, looking around, and hey, Mark, I want to introduce you to Special Agent so-and-so, Special Agent so-and-so. I'm thinking, what the hell did I do?
Right.
And they said, listen, we brought you in here because we trust you. This is highly confidential, but you are the public affairs coordinator for the division, and you need to know this. And so-and-so, I won't say his name on air, but we have reason to believe through the investigation of the FBI that Sergeant so-and-so is engaged in the trafficking of child pornography.
Ooh.
And my heart just sunk. I said, I'm thinking, this is like a nightmare. And someone I've known all this time. And it turns out that they were right. They had some more investigation to do to make sure they were, not just getting the ping from the household, but from his devices, things like this. And that's what happened. So, and there are other examples, but that one jumps right out at me. So yes, I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, and the one that I was involved in, Mark, I always think back to it because without getting into a long discussion about it, a situation came up where, we were doing a particular operation, and there were kind of two ways that it could have went. If it went one way, I would have, as the supervisor of the team, I would have taken a little bit of heat, right? I would have taken a little bit of heat. Would have been a little uncomfortable. And this guy had a choice where he could have directed things in that manner, or he could direct the things in another way where I didn't take the heat and the operation went successfully. But this person who had information about his corruption was going to get arrested. Mm-hmm. And that's the route that he took. So I often look back and I thought, wow, that was weird. Like, even though he was corrupt, he really had an opportunity to protect himself, but it would have meant that administratively he created an issue for me because this operation would have went a way it was not authorized to go. But instead, he did it the way that it was authorized to go, caused this person to be arrested, and this person almost immediately went to the FBI and said, hey, let me tell you what I know about this cop. So I always thought that was kind of strange. Mm-hmm. Back to the real topic, though, Mark. It is corruption. It's the story of Vicky White, who was the deputy director. And let me see if I can get exactly where this was. This was the city of Florence in Lauderdale County, Alabama. And Vicky White was the deputy director of custody. And so this is a small-ish jail facility in Alabama. Do you remember how long she worked there, Mark? I don't. I remember.
I want to say 18 years.
Yep. Okay. So I was thinking 17, 18 years. So she had worked there quite a long time. All of a sudden, I guess the place to start is kind of follow the timeline of the documentary. In 2022, April 28th, this 17, 18-year employee submits her resignation letter, and it's effective the next day, April 29th. That right there is a little bit strange.
I'd say so.
Right. So even just that, I mean, hey, I guess people have their own way of wanting to leave the career. And, there's always that saying, Mark, 2 bad days or 3 bad days and I'm gone or whatever. But that maybe should raise a couple eyebrows. And I guess leading up to that, there were conversations she had about being under a lot of stress and a lot of stressful stuff going on. regardless of all that, we'll touch on those other things in a minute. But the next day comes April 29th. And because of her role as deputy director, she kind of calls the shots in this custody facility. And she calls for this one prisoner to be brought up to the booking area, whatever, shackled and readied for transport. They bring him up. She takes him out by herself. He's Casey White. He's there on a capital murder charge. I want to say that I think he had 10 visits to the county jail in the past 11 years. Obviously in and out of trouble. And like I said, currently facing a murder charge. She says she's going to take him to the courthouse for a mental health evaluation. Obviously, I don't know. I'm sure you don't know how things work in this particular Alabama county, if that's normal, abnormal, but they disappear. Can you remember back, Mark, to when this happened, before finding out the additional details, just that part of it where you think, oh, this capital murder suspect was being transported by this female deputy by herself, and they're both missing. What were your first thoughts on it?
You were asking me to actually remember when this happened in real
time.
Yeah,
if you did, if you even remember hearing about it when it happened.
Yeah. The truth is, I remember the story. Mm-hmm. I remember the story very well. And by the time that it became news, there was enough detail that I remember seeing the first news conference. They already had a reason to believe that she had conspired with this inmate. So I didn't really have time to digest, any other details. They already had a reason to believe they were putting out there. And I can't remember if they actually gave a detail, but so we have reason to believe that this was not an abduction, things like this, that she was actually taking part in a crime. So, that's my first recollection of it. And again, so I didn't really have anywhere else to go when I first saw this. I thought, and by the way, it's not the first story like this. So when I heard those proclamations by the authorities, I thought, oh my God, it's happened again.
Right. That's interesting, because I remember hearing about it and probably not hearing all the details, right? Just hearing about this guy escaped, and I thought, oh man, he definitely killed her. And, he somehow got free in the car, killed her, and he's off on his own somewhere. And like you said,
by the way, Bill, sorry to interrupt, but what I'm saying is, it's the first time I remember hearing about it. So you may have heard about it earlier and, had a little, fresh information from the start. By the time it got into my world, they were talking about that this is probably a conspiracy.
Yep. And I think, listen, for me, I probably just didn't listen to the details. I just heard, guy escaped and immediately went to the assumption that he overpowered, his escort or whatever. Do you think that's unusual, though, that they would have a capital murder suspect being transported by a single deputy, not to say, male, female, just the fact that it's a lone deputy transporting a high risk inmate? Do you think that's unusual?
In my experience, terribly unusual. In other words, I mean, as a matter of fact, in the documentary, there's an example where another custody officer is transporting a high threat individual to court or to a psych eval, whatever it is, mental evaluation, and she's actually on the radio letting people know that, hey, just FYI, I'm transporting so and so. And even that protocol, I thought that was lacking. In other words, there should be multiple, deputies or custody officers in a van with something like this. But with her, and we will get into this, but we know that she had done a trial run with this earlier, but I didn't want to get ahead of the game. But yeah, I thought the whole protocol that I saw in there, in other words, it was unusual for what I was used to in lockup in municipal courts, and then in IRC, which is Inmate Receiving Center, Main County Jail in Los Angeles. Very, very different protocols.
Right. I agree with that. So the day that this happened, April 29th, 2022, another thing that I thought was interesting is this. I was trying to get a feel for how big this facility is. And I watched this documentary a couple times, and I finally caught that the sheriff, now retired, whatever, he said the normal staffing was 11 deputies per shift, which is not many. So it can't be that big a facility to staff it with just 11 deputies per shift. And the day that this escape happened, there were only 5 deputies on duty. So operating at less than 50% staffing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is that so? When you were in a leadership position at CHP, did you have issues like that staffing? Because here's where I'm getting at, and we talked about this in terms of the Secret Service mission a few months ago. Zero fail mission. At DEA, when we were short on manpower, we could generally put an operation off, or our office was big enough that we could bring in people from somewhere else that could help in a particular operation if it had to go. When you're talking about like a jail facility, at what point, you know, what's the danger point where you say, hey, we can't run the facility with less than half staffing? Someone's going to come to work today. Have you seen that at CHP where there were decisions that had to be made where you were like, you can't so in LA County, knowing a lot of the deputies that work custody, this is going to sound funny to people, they actually would get locked in. Like their shift would be over and they'd be told, no, you're not going home. We don't have the staffing to run the next shift. You're being held over to work a double shift. And that's not uncommon now. And that's really never been uncommon. What's your experience with that?
Well, very similar with the CHP, as the example you just gave with the LA County Sheriff's Department. We would have something called mandatory overtime. Mm-hmm. And that's just another phrase that describes what you just articulated. Now, again, it didn't always happen, but what they're called, Bill, with the CHP, a lot of agencies is called priority. This is your priority threshold. You have to have this many people working given the number of people assigned to a shift. And those are all formulas that are worked out, certainly at a local station, things like that, but in a larger deployment sense as well. Now, again, sometimes depending on whatever situations are out there, even with mandatory overtime, you're not going to be able to meet your priority. You're going to be understaffed, things like that happen. Mm-hmm. This is the problem when, in other words, it's one thing if you're down, if you have a priority of 11 deputies and you're down by 30%, that's 3 or 4 people gone. That's a huge chunk. Now, if your priority is 18 people and you're down to 12, working patrol, things like this, it's because of the larger number, it's not that impactful. But when you go from 11 to 5, that's huge. So I don't know what the protocol was there as far as mandatory. Like you said, they locked the deputies in. By the way, on an ancillary note, I don't know where they are now, but for years and years and years, I want to say maybe decades, the LA County Sheriff's Department just run on overtime. Yeah. Like LA City Fire Department. In other words, that's just how they operate. Everybody's working overtime. Yep. I don't think that's the same case for these smaller agencies that we're talking about now. But yeah, that's a huge impact. How they get down to 5. Obviously, if you have 6 people, you have 5 people just calling sick all at the same time an hour before shift starts. Those are things that are very, very difficult to remedy. Yeah. But
the other question, Mark, is her role was deputy director of custody. So correct. Is she the one that these staffing reports would have gone to? And was she the decision maker that said 5 people on this day is okay because she knew that certain roles wouldn't be filled, or it would create a situation where it was much easier for her to help this inmate escape because she orchestrated the staffing, or she allowed the staffing to be at that level?
That's what it looks like.
It looks like that. Yeah, we don't know that, but that's an interesting point. When the corrupt individual is in a leadership position, it becomes a lot more dangerous, right? Because they have the ability to kind of orchestrate and make things happen in a way that's going to, accomplish what they want to do. So she takes this capital murder suspect out, ostensibly to go to court, never shows up at court. They put a bolo out. They search the courthouse. They find the patrol car abandoned at a shopping center. And I think around this time, they realize that she is a willing participant in this. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, part of it came from just, I think, the body language. Even from what I remember, they talked about when she left the facility with him, he walked behind her, which was something that you would never do in a custodial situation. Like she opened the door, held the door for him, and he walked through by just something. Am I right about that, Mark? They made some
100%.
comment
I
like
remember
that.
watching
Yeah,
that video, and
yeah,
they talked about that. What a breach of protocol, officer safety protocol that was. And by the way, then you go back and couple that with the fact that she put in this resignation, effective tomorrow.
yeah. That's a great point. Right,
and
right.
and,
That's
and then other people are talking about some of her. I think there were subordinates, maybe a couple of peers here, but I think because she was number 2 in charge of the entire facility.
mhm.
But there's some other subordinates you're talking about. Man, I wanted to ask her, is your health okay, or what's going on? Because the last couple of weeks she seemed so on edge, and she wasn't like herself, and she was distracted. So I think they put all these things together pretty quickly.
And I think that's also a good point where I wonder, and we don't, I mean, we don't know, right? Because again, we're watching a documentary that shows the producer or director's point of view, or what he wants the point of view to be. We don't know if anyone had a real conversation with her, like, hey, what's going on, where she might have not necessarily confessed, but maybe discussed a little bit more about what was going on in her life and caused her to change her mind about it, because she did talk to coworkers about being under a lot of stress. And I'm curious what actions, if any, anyone in that department took to address that. I'm sure you and I have been to countless hours of training, Mark, on identifying areas where employees need assistance with issues, like that, stress, whatever, and referring them to resources. Doesn't appear that any of that was done, but really, who knows, right?
Yeah, who knows?
So I guess to me, the case really becomes interesting when they go to her house, or the place where she's living, and they search it, and they find a couple things there. The first thing they find, I think, is some banking records, which shows she took out a large amount of cash. They never did say how much, but she had recently sold her house, and sold it in a manner where she didn't get the highest return on it, or she didn't get as much as she could have if she really marketed the house. It's almost like she just put it up for some auction, and they made it look, from the documentary, from the numbers I caught, like maybe the value, what she got was 90,000 or something, and it could have been
Yes.
worth closer to 200,000 if it
Yeah, I
was
was gonna say
marketed right.
it was about 50% of what she could have
Yeah,
gotten for
it
the
seemed
house
like
in the
that. So,
market.
that's obviously something that's a little strange. And the big thing for me, with my background in telephones, was they found a telephone number at the house, or a phone bill at the house, or something, on a phone number that they didn't know she had. And they ran that through the jailhouse system. All the calls in most custodial facilities around the country are recorded. They ran that number through the system, and they found that Casey White, the inmate, had been calling that number for 18 months and having a ton of conversations with Vicky White. All those conversations are recording. They start listening to him, and when they start listening to him, Mark, what's some of the general stuff that they hear?
Well, we won't get into everything, but you can only guess. But a lot of it was, the way a lot of these things start. They start talking about personal information, kind of his background, how things happen. I'm not a bad guy, so forth and so on. And of course, it eventually evolved into, you're a good-looking guy, or you're so hot, and then you're my queen, and so forth and
Mm-hmm.
so on. And then they start engaging in some X-rated conversations, on the phone, and these went on for hours, many of them. So, and I have a question for you, Bill, and
Yeah.
I guess it's one I should be able to answer. Like you said, they're all recorded. That's why the investigators were able to listen to them, but they're not being listened to at the time. Obviously, they're recorded for future use if needed.
Yep.
But in a lot of facilities, I would imagine maybe it's only in state facilities that each of these phone calls, they are monitored in real time, as far as I understand, at least in California. Um, but they weren't listened to at the time. And of course, she knew that. She's a
Yep.
supervisor, so
Yep.
she knew she'd get away with this, at least initially.
When jailhouses record phone calls, most of it really, most of the reason they're doing that is to to stop contraband from getting into the jail. That's really, I mean, they're not really, those jailhouse investigators, or the jailhouse workers are concerned with what's going on in their facility. They're not necessarily trying to further a criminal case on the outside. Investigators will reach out to them and ask them specifically to do that and to target specific numbers and people, etc. But really, when the jail reviews those calls, they're looking for people that are bringing in contraband and distributing it throughout the prison. And whose role was it to do that? From the documentary, it sounded like that was her roles. That was one of the things she did, was listen to those jailhouse calls and target contraband coming in. So,
and apparently she did it very, very well.
Right. Right. They made it a point to say that. So my question is, you know, there's 11 people that work in this facility on shift. If anyone was listening to those calls at any point in time, so even if it's not live, right? If anyone was listening to those calls at any point in time, would not someone recognize her voice? Because you touched on the nature of the conversations. I wrote down 3 things that they talked about in these calls, Mark, all of which violations of, if not law, policy. Drug use. They talked about him using drugs while in the facility. Sex. And they talked about sex. He talked about sex with her.
Yes.
That they apparently had in the facility, and escape. They talked about plans for the future. She said, I had the quote somewhere here that, she said something to the effect like, well, I'm going to get you out of there. Don't worry. Would not someone, if anyone had listened to any of these things, in a small facility like that, with that limited number of people, would not someone have recognized the voice? Or does it just sound like there was really no protocol to do any kind of spot checking, even on these high profile inmates, and do any kind of proactive stuff on them? Is that what it sounds like?
Well, it sounds like it, I think. And by the way, if you're talking about escape, whether it's an employee or not, the sex and obviously it's a violation of employee, all those things like this, but it wouldn't be with whatever, a girlfriend or someone outside. But escape, it doesn't matter who it is, the employee or it's your next door neighbor. Right. That right there would be a conspiracy to commit a crime.
Right.
So they wouldn't even have to recognize the voice. And by the way, it's a great point you bring up, Bill, about recognize the voice. I hadn't even thought about that until you brought it up right now and you laid out those 3 elements. But that was a conspiracy to commit a crime. I'm going to get you out of there. Mm-hmm. That is an articulated action with intent, and so that would be a crime. So clearly, and again, she's in a supervisor role. Maybe she's the one who spot checks conversations. Maybe it's only her, or someone she'll designate. But obviously, I can't imagine any employee hearing that and not reporting it. That would be a sub-story to this one if that happened.
Yeah, because this is 18 months of conversations. And at one point he said, as long as he said he wanted to talk to her or was talking to her once or twice a day. And again, they talked about never looking back, having fun on their adventures. Here's the quote. She said, "I'm going to get you out of there." I mean, that's pretty clear language. And, even someone just catching a glimpse of these calls, she talked about her job in the facility. He talked about what she was doing. Like, what I'm saying is, I don't think you'd have to listen to too much of these calls, and they played them in the documentary, to understand that this is 2 people that were in the facility talking about each other.
Right.
And, that would raise a red flag. What did she buy moving up to this point? So she had bought some guns, moving as they got closer to April 29th. She had bought some camping gear and seemed to be somewhat careful about how she bought it. Although I didn't really catch that. I don't know if you caught exactly what
she'd go into Walmart or whatever the establishment was. I think it was Walmart. They actually mentioned by name, but she'd go in and buy her groceries, and she'd buy one camping item at a time with it every time she went in, trying to not make this obvious. So obviously the mindset of intention is pretty clear.
He suggested that she get a 44 Magnum revolver.
Yeah.
You know?
He's going all the way.
Yeah. Um, Here's an interesting point. So I guess another thing within her purview there, or part of her role, was she was responsible for abandoned inmate property.
Hmm.
So somehow they determined that she went through or did searches looking for inmates, male, female inmates that were generally similar to their physical descriptions. And I
Hmm.
guess what they're intimating there is that these are the IDs that they assumed when they went on the run, or that she somehow took these IDs and that's what they used when they were on the run. Is that what you took from that?
I thought that there was that, and I thought there was more to it. It had to do with uh, I thought there was some nexus to apparel or something with him, but I could be wrong. Maybe she was buying stuff and she was literally measuring other people up to find out what he would need.
Got
But
it.
there were certain, yeah, there was certainly the ID aspect of it as
And he
well.
did.
Yes,
So she did buy him all, new clothes. She bought him
yes,
clothes to
right.
that obviously for him to wear when he got out. Mark, you mentioned the dry run. I didn't really. What do you make of that? Because I didn't really follow like how what that was all about. I mean,
Yeah.
I thought I caught that they were gone for only 9 minutes, and I'm like, how is that?
So there was two. There was
Okay,
one, yeah. So the first one that she took him to for his was it his evaluation? I forget what it was, and gone for a while. But the second one, she took uh, put him in the patrol car and just went out for 9 minutes without any pre-authorization, without any record keeping, things like this, any appointment, any calendar.
got
Just
it.
took him out of the facility, and she was gone for a short time. She wanted to see if there was going to be reaction, if any red
Ah,
flags were thrown up. So she was gone for 9 minutes, and then came back, and nothing happened. And that was the dry run that I was talking about. She
okay,
wanted to
got it.
find out
So
how long she could be gone before they were onto her.
that makes it so more. It was more to gauge reaction, like what's going to
Hmm.
happen when I do this. Is it going to
Yeah,
be red flagged right away? I see.
yeah. And my assumption is she didn't want to be gone so long that, in other words, eventually say, hey,
Yeah.
where's,
Yep.
yeah, but just long enough to find out if she could get out without any pre-authorization, without any documentation, with any heads up, without any log, and she was able to do that, and I think that was the first step here, getting ready to go the dry run.
Also, they talked about when she brought him back in from that dry run, there was another patrol car parked in the Sally Port, and she had to
Yes.
take him in through a side door, which was unusual and would have been outside of protocol. And,
Hmm.
no one asked any questions about that.
Yeah, because she didn't want to come back. Yeah, she didn't want to come back in.
They probably would have asked, like,
Correct.
where have you been or what were you doing? Right, right.
Right.
Yeah, interesting.
Hmm.
So that does make a lot more sense to me now. Um, so the cars, I mean, really, the leads and how they tracked them down was really, I think, predominantly through the cars that they were driving. Started in the
Hmm.
patrol car, they ditched that in a shopping center, and my understanding was there they got into Vicky White's car
Hmm.
and drove that for a while. I don't know where they abandoned that, but they bought or she bought then a
Yeah.
orange or red Ford Edge,
Edge. Hmm.
a fucking, a car that really stands out, Mark.
Well, you can say you can say that again. My wife had a white Ford Edge for a while before we traded it in for a nicer model. But I was thinking, how stupid are these people? Talk
Hmm.
about red flags. This is an
Hmm.
orange flag on four wheels, and how many orange vehicles period are there out there? And they got a high profile one.
And that burned him because I think it
Yeah.
was in Tennessee. A guy who owned a towing company
Hmm.
um, called like a hotline or some tip line, or maybe he just called the local police. I don't know. And he said, "Hey, I just impounded a car that fits that description in this area."
Hmm.
And sure enough, that turned out to be the car. And believe me, had it been a silver Honda or a white Honda sedan, they probably impound five of them a day. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
just the choice of that car,
and
not,
you can
not
tell how obvious it was to the career criminal
right.
Casey White, because he starts spray painting it green, which I thought was like, well, could you spray paint it white or maybe
Right.
black, or he went from orange to green. I
Right.
mean, but he did realize what a sore thumb this vehicle
Yeah.
was, and he wanted to start covering up to look worse two-tone than it did just all orange. But anyway.
So they dumped that car. Now I don't know how many days later this was. I didn't do a good job of keeping track of that, but a few days later, I don't know, I think the whole thing was maybe 10, 11 days, the whole escapade. So maybe we're about halfway through their flight now. And, they're putting these stories on the news. They could be anywhere. They could be in Alaska. A guy reports that he sold Casey White a Ford F-150 pickup truck. And I don't remember who he was, maybe somewhere just north of Tennessee, or maybe he was in Tennessee near where they ditched the Ford Edge. So they get the information. Go ahead.
I forget as well exactly where that was, but yeah.
They get the information on that car, and then that car is located in a what do they call it? A self car wash or something?
Yeah,
one of those self car wash bays.
Just a stalls. Yep, the base. That's right.
In somewhere in Evansville, Indiana, or somewhere in Indiana, and that guy, the owner of the car wash, actually doesn't just call the police, but he apparently calls the media too. He somehow figures out that's the truck that's wanted. And one thing I think the police did a good job of in this case, and they do in, a lot of homicide cases that I've been involved in over the years, is looking for video evidence of people, whether it's Ring cameras, whether it's security cameras, cameras at businesses. I mean, that's how they originally identified the orange Ford Edge. They found her car abandoned in a parking lot, looked at all the video from that parking lot going back a couple days, and there she is walking across the parking lot, getting into this orange or red Ford Edge. Same thing at this car wash. They had a camera. They looked at who parked that F-150 there. It was Casey White. He had a gun. From another camera angle, they see him walk away from the car wash, and he's picked up in a Cadillac coupe, right? Cadillac sedan, whatever.
Yep. I think it was
and
coupe, yeah.
They end up finding that Cadillac at a local hotel, like an old Motel 6.
A little motel. And by the way, and Bill, this is where it was just great cop work, like you said, because they put the word out internally and they just start canvassing the area with everything they had, looking for this Cadillac.
Mm-hmm.
And an officer or deputy, like, hey, that looks like it right there. And then again, they didn't have a license plate. I don't believe they just had a make and model, the color, and they were able to get it just with good old fashioned cop work.
Yep, thought they saw it in the area at a hotel. Now, what was interesting is then they looked at the registration. I don't know who was registered at the hotel or who was staying at the hotel. No names stood out, so not surprising, right? They just didn't know what names these two were using. Somehow they found out that a pizza was delivered there. And again, I don't know how they did that. They didn't really say. I don't know whether they were proactive and they looked to the maybe camera at the hotel. What do you think?
Yeah, I think they saw the pizza delivery.
Got it.
So then they start calling the local restaurants, whoever it was, and they go, oh, yeah. And I don't want to get ahead of you. You can go ahead, but I remember what happened. Yeah. So they went out and they started interviewing people. Oh, yeah, I remember delivering that pizza to room number so-and-so. And yeah, oh, yeah, those are the two people. They just pull them out of a lineup on a photo card.
Yeah. So they set up on the hotel, and it sounds like pretty shortly after they set up on the hotel doing surveillance, the couple comes out, they get in the Cadillac, they drive away, and almost immediately there's a pursuit.
Yeah.
And here's where I have a question for you. And I don't know, man, maybe you were already in a leadership position at CHP when all this stuff came out, but all of a sudden an OnStar call is connected. So what happened was, they're in the pursuit, and somehow, so I got to think, once they identified this Cadillac, the cops must have gone to General Motors or gone to OnStar or whatever and got access to this, or found a number, or found a way to contact the car. And somehow during this pursuit, all of it, maybe the Vicky White or Casey White initiated a OnStar call inside the car, whatever. Somehow they connected the audio inside the car.
Yeah, now it's coming back to me. But
yep, and you can hear her talking to him as they're fleeing the scene. I just wondered if you had any experience with that, how that could have happened. But whatever, let's assume maybe she called or she or he hit the OnStar button. They're in a pursuit. They get in a crash, and then there's a gunshot, right? Vicky White is shot in the head. Casey White is taken out of the car. Vicky White takes him a while to get her out of the car. The car was kind of turned on its side in a little bit of a ditch at the side of the road, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the question is, Mark, I mean, they ruled it. The investigator that had kind of been the lead investigator on the whole escape, he said, hey, it was a strange placement. It was a shot to the back of the head. It was a weird angle. They put it as an accidental, which I'd not really heard that described. I mean, I guess technically that's accurate. When there's an accidental shooting,
Mm-hmm.
it fits both. It is a, and it could be accidental. What's your gut feeling on that, Mark? As we come back to the questions that we mentioned at the beginning of this, do you because what do you think? Do you think it was a, or do you think that Casey White killed Vicky White at the end of that?
So there are a few things. Number one, it was ruled by the county coroner, the medical examiner. So that's the first thing I go with is, okay, what does the experts say? Things like that. They've been wrong before. They've changed their minds before, but it's the first thing I go with. They said it was a suicide. Number two, I look at her emotional state. Look, for that, lack of a better word, she was wacko. I mean, sorry, she went off the deep end. So there's certainly some emotional, psychological problems. Number three would be, what would be in it for Casey White? He's already, up in murder, things like this. Did she do anything to him? Did she cause him to get caught? Was there any real animosity? I don't see it. So without anything else, I mean, again, the deputy says, or the detective says, it was a weird place for, a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It might be. Is it impossible that it happened? Not according to the medical examiner. So I went back and forth on this, and I read a couple of articles about it, and I couldn't find anything that would sway me from leaning on the side it actually was, just because I don't have anything to push me that way.
Right.
If I had a videotape of him shooting her, I said, well, it doesn't surprise me. The guy's a career criminal. He's a murderer. He is a nasty, nasty person. Why he did it, we'll never know. That's possible too, but I'm leaning the side that it probably was a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Yeah, at first, my first instinct was the other way. I said, oh, he killed her. He was trying to keep her quiet because and then I really, within about 15 minutes of seeing it, I kind of went to where you're at, where I said, no, it was, and I almost feel like she made that decision when she first started helping him plan this escape. I really do. I feel like, do you remember what she told one of her employees about leaving there? She told one of her coworkers, I'm going to go out with a bang.
Oh,
you remember that?
Yeah.
And her coworker even, said that, hey, she said she was going to go out with a bang. And she's like, girl, she went out with a bang. And it was almost like, for whatever reason, for whatever was going on in her life, she almost made the decision to end it back when she started helping him, because I can't see how it was really, in reality, how it was foreseeable that it would end any other way. I mean, I guess in some fantasy world, you could say, we're gonna escape and we're gonna live in a trailer in Tennessee for the next 10 years and no one's gonna find us. But is that really even something that's fathomable in the world of reality, that she could have thought that? So no, I kind of came to the conclusion that she, for whatever reason, where she was at in life, she made the decision to do this, knowing that it probably wasn't going to end too well for her, or at least it might not. And boom, was where it was at. So Casey did get charged with murder, but it's more, not, how would you describe that, Mark? Like, he didn't get charged with murder. He got charged with kind of like contributing to her death in the commission of a felony or something like that, right?
Well, it's funny because you can read one article, another, and one actually says he got charged with murder, and they kind of leave it at that. And I'm reading and say, well, how? How did he, if he can't charge with murder? So there is some ambiguity depending on what you read, of what I read. So I'm with you. I've never heard of anything like this. I mean, if if they got in a gunfight and an officer had been killed by her, if she had shot somebody else, that would be murder, because he would actually be engaged in a felonious act with a firearm, and that would be certainly a second-degree murder, if not a first-degree murder. But
Right.
this case where you shoot yourself, I don't see how it's murder.
Yeah, where you shoot yourself, I see that as tough. I have seen cases where, like two partners in crime, one of them will be killed by police, and the other partner in
Correct.
crime will be charged with that murder
That's
because
right.
I don't know what the word I'm looking for. He contributed
Yes.
to that murder by the criminal
Mhm.
or to the death just by that criminal scheme. He's responsible for it, I
Right.
guess.
That's
By
right.
being there and committing that crime, he basically caused the police to have to shoot that guy. So
That's right.
yeah. One of the other, the other question, Mark, is: do you think where do you stand with the relationship between the two of them? Was it because he had tried to cozy up to
Yeah.
another female employee at the jail?
Mhm.
He had tried to cozy up to male employees at the jail just to get cigarettes or whatever. And when they shut him down, he would never talk to him again. And we'll talk in a minute about what one of his cellmates says about the relationship. But what do
Yes.
you think about the relationship? Just your gut feeling, real on one side, or where are you at?
Well, if anything, the only real honest love, for lack of a better word, this came from Vicky White. But for as far as he's concerned, he's just a manipulator, nothing more. He's just an evil user of people. That's it. She was garbage. She was throwaway. She was conduit to escape. That's all she was to him. That's what I believe wholeheartedly.
Yep.
As far as her relationship, from the relationship from her perspective, this is someone who we know that she said to coworkers and family that she would go home after every shift and drink until she went to sleep.
Yep.
Drink herself to sleep every single day of her life. This person was coming from a very, very dark place.
Yep.
And was he just another escape for her? No pun intended.
Yeah.
Emotional escape for her. Was she looking for something she couldn't find in a bottle? Probably. Did she really, have emotions for him, affection for him? Probably. But was it deranged? Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I agree with that assessment, Mark. I think he was just a master manipulator, and unfortunately, she fell for it. Cost her life, and he got 10 days of freedom for it. 10, 11 days of freedom for it. What was interesting, though, was one of his cellmates, and I don't really, I didn't know what to make of that guy, right?
Yeah, I didn't like him, by the way.
You didn't like him. You didn't like him.
No.
Yeah. He, in his mind, I don't have the exact language he used, but something to the effect like he said, hey, don't paint him out to be some mass murderer. Don't paint her out to be some naive pawn. She was the deputy director of this place. She was an expert at dealing with prisoners. He was a manipulator. This cellmates thing was these two just fell in love, and to the two of them, that 11 days was worth it, and don't make it out to be anything more or less than that.
Yeah, well, I said this is one of the reasons I didn't like him.
Yeah. Right.
Coupled with the fact that he was very aware that they were actually having a sexual relationship in the jail. In other
Right.
words, that she would come down, she was a supervisor, she would send everybody else out, open all the cells, whatever, because they would have multiple people in that cell where Casey
Yep.
White was, and that he stayed behind, and she'd enter the cell, and she would leave the door just cracked enough, because once you close it, well, she wouldn't be able to get out, of course,
Yeah.
but it also sends a signal when
Right.
they're open and closed. And so he knew what they were doing in there. And so for this guy, look, they're all criminals. I mean,
Yeah.
he probably wasn't
Yeah,
in there
yeah,
just for DUI.
No.
I forget what he was in there for, but
It was so a good point. He was a cop, Mark.
oh,
I think
that's right.
He
I
was a
forgot
cop who was in there for domestic violence.
That's right.
Or but I mean, no, or whatever, couldn't make bail or didn't have bail.
Mhm.
It must have been some kind of serious
That's a good point.
charge. And
That's a good point.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm not glad that for why he got arrested, because I feel for his spouse or significant other. but I'm glad he was in jail, and I'm sure he lost his job as a cop. Piece of crap.
So we agree she committed. We agree, or it was at least an accidental shooting. I think she did it on purpose.
Yeah.
We agree that he was just an exploiter and took advantage of her, and even all the talk at the end where when he was saying, "How is my wife? Did you catch that? Is my wife okay? It just didn't sound genuine to me.
No.
Whatever.
Look, a manipulator's a manipulator
To the end. Yeah.
To the end, and he's playing that role all the way. That's just his makeup. You and I like to breathe, and manipulators like to manipulate all the way to the end. Whether it's a custody officer or whether it's a detective from law enforcement agency, they like to manipulate and influence people.
Right. Final question, Mark, as we wrap this up. Were there signs that should have been seen here? I get it. It's a small department, but were there things happening in the facility that someone probably should have caught? And did it slip by maybe because of her position and because of her outstanding reputation? Again, going back to the guy that I spoke of at the beginning where I had dealings with corruption, it was someone who had a great reputation, extremely hard worker, and a producer. And that factors into it because, perhaps people aren't looking as closely at them or they're giving them more leeway. What do you think? Should something have been seen leading up to this?
Probably. In fact, absolutely. There are a couple of factors here. One, look, I think we go back now, Bill. If we took a tour there, you and I would be able to see that protocols are different today than they were from 3 years ago, 2 years ago, whatever. 100%. Just from being, on a tour, we could see. Number one. So protocols were lax. More important, and they make this point in the documentary that this person was number 2 under the sheriff in charge of the entire facility.
Yeah.
So she was the boss of everybody in that facility whenever she was there.
Yeah. You
couple that with the fact that she was loved. She said that everybody said that she was the answer person. If you have a question that Vicky would give you the answer. She would find it. She would fix the problem. That she was kind to everybody. She was so well liked. And then she was 5-time employee of the year in the system. So she had a lot of creds behind her personality as well. She wasn't a nice person. She wasn't just knowledgeable, but she was well respected because she'd been honored by her peers and supervisors as well.
Right.
So when you couple the fact that there are very lax protocols in that facility with someone of her stature and was so well liked, then you know what? It's wide open. And that's what happened.
Yep. Recipe for disaster. Interesting documentary, interesting story. Let's hope that people have learned from that, at least, in the custody world and have taken steps to prevent something like that from happening again. Mark, thanks for joining me to talk about this one. We'll see everyone next time on Truth Nation.